Hi, everybody. As promised, at 12:05 sharp, we are starting. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. We have over 130 participants. I think it shows how dedicated all of us are to public transit, given the fact that we're fighting for this, despite the fact that few of us can even use it. And two, all of you are gigantic nerds, and it's embarrassing to know all of you, but I love you nonetheless. So my name is Armand Damaluski. I'm with Seamless Barrier Transit, one of the members of the board of directors. I'll be moderating today. We're a grassroots group working to transform Barrier's fragmented and inconvenient public transit system into an efficient, integrated, and rider-friendly system. We're super, super proud to present today with two amazing partners, one of whom I've actually worked with a lot in the past, and the other one who I've seen the work from a distance and really admired, San Francisco Transit Riders and Transform. I know many of you are already engaged in advocacy around transit area. We're super appreciative. Thank you so much. And, you know, especially in a time like this, it's just been a devastating month for all of us, and in particular for public transit. We've seen public transit ridership numbers collapse. We've seen operators and riders get really, really sick. And it's hard to keep track of everything going on. So we want to make sure that we can all come together and figure out how to best focus our energy on these important issues. So today you'll be hearing from Haley Courier, Policy Advocacy Manager at Transform, Kat Carter, Acting Executive Director at the San Francisco Transit Riders, Adina Levin, Seamless Barriers Director of Advocacy, and Ian Griffiths, Co-founder and Policy Director. These experts will share the latest news on transit impacts, emergency transit funding, as well as information on actions you can take right now to ensure that our transit system emerges stronger and more resilient after the COVID-19 crisis. So before we get started, a few logistical notes. We invite everyone on the call to submit comments or questions to the Zoom chat function as presentations are taking place. We're going to be reserving 10 to 15 minutes of time for Q&A after Adina's and Ian's presentations. If you'd rather wait and raise your hands to ask the question live then. So you can either drop them in the chat and then we'll get to them at the end, or wait, raise your hand, and we'll ask you then. And so after today's call, we'll be sending out an email to all webinar participants, includes a summary of the information you'll be hearing today, as well as a cheat sheet of actions you take right now to support Bay Area transit operators and in the coming weeks. Before we sort of turn it over, I want to kick things off with a poll that we're going to be launching really quickly. And so the poll we're going to have, the first one is, we just want to know, where everybody's coming from. So it's, what county are you sheltering in place in? So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And while the poll is going, I'll let it run for a couple of minutes. I'll introduce our panelists. So let me turn it over to Haley Courier, Policy Advocacy Manager at Transform.
Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Courier. Transform is a regional transportation justice advocacy organization. We've been advocating for transportation funding that centers equity and climate for the past 20 years, over 20 years. And we focus on work at the regional level and how regional funding and planning is distributed at the county level, at the CMA level and with county measures, as well as at the state level, thinking about how transportation funding and housing is managed there. And we actually also work a lot at the intersection of housing and transportation, because as we all know, if we don't get housing right, we won't get transit right. And these two issues are inextricably linked. So thanks so much for having me.
Maybe Kat, you go.
Yeah, let's have Kat next. There's so many little features here, so I have to get to unmute myself. Yes, let's have Kat next, the acting executive director of San Francisco Transit Riders.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here today, and I'm so impressed with the turnout. It's really really helps lift my spirits. So we're San Francisco Transit Riders. We're a member-supported independent nonprofit advocating for excellent transit in San Francisco. We work to raise the rider's voice and influence the planning process to get the best results possible for transit improvements and, you know, what it means to make transit awesome in San Francisco. A big win for us, for example, in the past year was getting the SFMTA to prioritize the 29 Sunset route for increased service and improvements. And they had started from a position of saying there's no resources for it. So we're able to start influencing their priorities like that. And I see that 29 Sunset made it into their like emergency essential service, the core service they have now. We're really excited to work with all the advocates on this call and others that we've been working with from around the region as well as around the country to work on transit funding. This is sort of a pivot from our normal everyday sort of grassroots, local, super local work. But we had we just done a supporter survey that's actually still good until tomorrow. I don't have the link right here, but a lot of supporters wanted to work on transit funding even before the current crisis. So I'm really heartened that we have a lot of support and a lot of momentum for this kind of work. During this emergency, we are trying to keep tabs on what's going on for riders and bus operators, but of course we can't be out there on Muni as we normally are. So we have a survey out as well for people who are. So if you are riding transit still, we're mostly Muni, but I'd love to hear from people around the region. And we have that survey at bit.ly/MuniRider. So just to hear what's happening, we know that one of the reasons there's a huge operator shortage is because they just don't have the testing, which they've now rolling out, and they don't have the personal protective equipment, and so operators can't be safe. So if we can start helping move those things forward, then we can hopefully increase service over time. But I look forward to the discussion today about more of that.
Thank you, Kat. And now we'll turn it over to Gina Levin, our policy director, to present on the current state of Bay Area transit as well as emergency funding. Unmute yourself, Adina. Here, I can go ahead and unmute you.
Okay, so
there you go.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's great to be here with so many people who care about public transportation and thinking about how we can get through this crisis, which is what I will be talking about, what we can do, what we already have done, and what we can do over the next year to help public transit continue and survive this crisis. And then I will hand it over to Ian Griffiths, who will be talking about what we'll be able to work on to help transit come back even better than before, so we can really recover as an economy and as a society. Can you move the slide forward? So as everyone here knows, on this call, where most of us are sheltering in place, the Bay Area has had a shelter in place order since March 17th. And none of us, Armand, can you close out the poll so I can see the slides? We are not traveling. The distance is down under any mode by 70% all around the region. And that is both people are not driving and in order to help stop the spread of the infection, and most people are not taking public transit. Next slide. So ridership is really down very dramatically. BART and Caltrain ridership are down by 90%. Bus and light rail ridership is down by about 80%. And in the face of trying to keep operators safe, and also with many fewer people riding, service has been really pared back. You can see the skeleton service that SFMTA is running. BART's down to every 30 minutes. Caltrain is down to every 30 to 60 minutes, really running skeleton service. And next slide, who is riding the service in this state of emergency? It's people who are essential to keeping the rest of us alive. Transit Center did some analysis showing that in normal times, 31% of transit commuters are essential workers. People who are serving groceries, working in pharmacies, working in healthcare and public safety to help the rest of society live through this crisis. Next slide. And the financial impact is really catastrophic. Armand, can you please close out the poll so I can see the numbers on the slide? The Transit Center has done some financial analysis showing that the cost to the transit system is like the losses are likely to be somewhere between 1.9 and 2.8 billion dollars in the coming year. A lot of that money is fares that people are not paying. Some of the agencies have gone fare free in order to protect operators from taking fares, as well as the steep ridership declines. Tax revenues that support public transit and the rest of our public services are also going to be catastrophically down. The numbers are not yet in, but that's expected to be about another 40% of reduced revenue. So what is being done to help deal with that catastrophic financial impact? So thankfully, transit advocates, including probably many of you on this call, have really banded together with advocacy focused on the state and federal level. At the federal level, helping to get the CARES Act, which passed in March, to provide $25 billion nationwide to support public transportation, including $1.3 billion here in the Bay Area, thanks to everyone who helped to sign a petition called your member of Congress to help get this funding, which will help in the coming months. But you saw that number on the previous slide. $1.3 billion will not fully close that $1.9 to $2.8 billion gap. So there's some things that we're going to need to continue to do in order to help ensure that public transit keeps running and helps keep our society, enable our society to recover from this pandemic. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission is going to be allocating the federal funding starting in April, and then with another tranche over the summer. We can keep an eye out for making sure that money is spent wisely. There may be opportunities with the state budget in the May-June timeframe, and possibly even additional state budgeting processes, with ideas like potentially using money that was originally conceived of to expand highways. Can we use that to help keep our public transit system running and recover? And there are expected to be additional rounds of federal funding where there's going to be opportunities for us as transit advocates to pay attention and to seek that funding to go to keep our public transportation system running and recover, because at the end of this pandemic, we are still going to have a public transportation crisis. Our society, which was inequitable before the pandemic, is hitting lower income people the hardest, and people are going to need to travel with economic challenges, travel to get to new jobs and look for jobs. We're going to need to have a public transportation system to help our economy and society recover and hopefully thrive. But to do that, we won't be able to, we can't just go back to the way the system was before, which was not serving those needs as well as before. And what Ian will do is talk through some ways that we can potentially help to bring the public transportation system back, not only the way that it was, but better in order to achieve those goals. I'll turn it over to Ian.
Great. Oh, thanks, Adina. My name is Ian Griffiths. I'm the Policy Director for Seamless Bay Area. So how do we rebuild, not just rebuild, but rebuild stronger? Because we know that transit was not keeping up even before this crisis hit. It was moving in a downward or stagnant trajectory. Buses were getting stuck in traffic. Fewer and fewer people across the region were using transit, even as our region grew. And When we look at the last economic crisis, there was a decline between 2000 and 2016, but when we look, we see in many parts of the region, particularly on our major bus agencies, there was a really major decline since the 2008 recession, and a large part of that was the service cuts that went into place due to this revenue crisis that existed due to sales tax revenue, in particular, drying up, forced many agencies to cut their service. And that is what has led to some of these very steep declines among many of our bus operators. Caltrain and BART have seen, and I believe the ferries are the agencies that have seen increases during that period, but those increases are more than offset by the decreases in our bus transit agencies. So we need to learn the lessons of the past crisis and be very, do everything we can to avoid those service cuts, which are going to be really detrimental to people using transit over the long term. Another reason, though, why transit ridership is not was not increasing before this crisis and continues to struggle is because of the experience of using transit. It is just not a cost or time efficient way oftentimes of getting across the region. And it's an extremely fragmented experience requiring for some trips navigating so many different agencies. There's actually 151 different agencies that are involved in Bay Area transit without clear leadership. 27, not only the 27 transit agencies, but 9 county transportation agencies, other statewide authorities. There's the 101 cities in the Bay Area who oftentimes control local streets, and that has a big impact on the ability of transit to provide competitive service. So all of these factors are contributing to making it very difficult to recover right now and in the future from transit. And just in terms of funding, all of this fragment, each of those different 27 transit agencies has a different funding source, a different mix of funding sources, and they're overall very reliant on fare box and county sales tax as the two largest sources, making up over 50% of all income. So, and those two sources have been heavily impacted by this current crisis. But you can just see this diagram, which shows, the various funding sources from fare box, state, local, and federal sources, and other sources on the left. And then on the right, you see, our 27 transit agencies that range in size from a few very large ones. These are measured by revenue, not by ridership. So SFMTA actually has greater ridership, even though it has a similar budget to BART. But this different mix of funding sources means that as these revenue sources dry up and they come back, that each agency is going to be in a different financial position to be able to bring in service differently. And that presents real challenges for how we plan service during this recovery period and during their crisis period. So what are inconveniences during a normal time has exposed additional seams in the network during this COVID-19 crisis. Agency by agency service cuts are taking place out of necessity, but there is no clear core service plan for the region. The way that SFMTA has developed this core service plan for the city of San Francisco, we really ought to have a consistent plan for how we make sure that we can move essential workers across the region with reliable service along our key corridors, regardless of the transit agency, and that just doesn't exist right now. And we don't have a clear leadership on that issue right now. That has resulted in gaps in service as transit agencies are making cuts based on a number of factors, but stopping times for service are now different across the region. Frequencies are different, and these gaps are getting wider than ever. There is a different approach to how emergency planning is done to protect workers and riders across the region. There isn't a clear way of communicating with all transit customers. So transit agencies are communicating through their own means, But there isn't, if you're a customer that uses multiple services, there's no one place you can go to find out and understand how the whole system is working. So, and as I mentioned, restoration of service in the recovery period, due to all these factors, is also going to be very likely to be uneven. You know, those agencies that are most reliant on sales tax and fares will have the hardest time adding back service, even once ridership recovers. And the fact that we don't have a regional plan with clear service expectations on our priority corridors means that, you know, that service will depend on local priorities, not necessarily regional connectivity and access. So AB 2057 is a bill that I'm sure many of you are aware of. This is the Bay Area Seamless Transit Act. This was an initiative that was underway well before this crisis that Seamless Bay Area has been working on to establish clear leadership and accountability for our regional transit system to be able to deliver a more connected network. And a core part of that is initiating a process so we can establish a clear transportation network manager for our region. This is something that we lack. This is something that MTC, which is our regional transportation authority in the Bay Area, and our MPO, it is not fulfilling this function. It doesn't provide the clear service standards or vision for the region. And many other regions across the world that have more integrated networks have a clarity on who is responsible for doing things like coordinating integrated fares, service standards, regional schedules, and in some cases, you know, emergency response and planning of the system. Having a network manager is not at odds with having separate independent transit agencies and operators, and many of these examples throughout the world are not just one merged agency, but have transit agencies that work more in greater collaboration with each other. So AB 2057, a summary of what this legislation would do is it establishes the state intent to create a network manager for the Bay Area within 2 years. And so that is not going to be clear, that is not going to address the current, you know, the very current COVID-19 crisis. But this is an approach to help us plan for a longer term recovery. So the network manager would be mandated to do those core regional functions that are important for us to have a more resilient system and a system that can attract more riders over the long term, coordinating fares, schedules, service standards, customer experience, branding, as well as long range capital planning and how we build out our system. And the proposed process in that bill for determining where that network manager should reside, whether it goes within an existing agency or a new agency, is that this task force of 19 members representing transit agency elected representatives and community and transit rider groups would be tasked with studying the collective performance of all the Bay Area transportation institutions and funding sources. And that's really important given that the funding is the core of the current. They'd be tasked with recommending governance reforms and funding reforms to existing agencies and recommending where that network manager function should ultimately reside. So in terms of the status of AB 2057, this bill was announced in February by Assemblymember David Hsu, and it is still moving forward. So there's obviously been a change in the legislative schedule due to the COVID-19 process, and the legislature is currently on recess. But so a number of these dates are still up in the air. But as far as we know, there will still be, we are still planning as though there is a legislative session this year. And from our latest information, that the legislature will resume in May. The general sequence of activities that this bill needs to go through in order to pass is that first it will go to the Assembly Transportation Committee. in May. Then it'll go, these are generalized timeframes. It'll then go to the full assembly for vote. Then it would go to the Senate Transportation Committee and then need to go to the Senate for a vote towards August. And then likely need to be signed by the governor by the end of August. The exact dates are still very much in flux and we're waiting for more information on this. So in terms of, I'll speak to the actions that we can do to ensure that this process of addressing these long-term governance issues gets started. The thing that we can do really right now, as shown in green, is in this, that is something that can happen during this, this period of April while the legislature is on recess, is submitting support letters to the assembly through a portal, which I'll share the link for. But that's really the most impactful thing that we can be doing right now to ensure that this bill continues to move forward and that it moves through these committees. So quickly, I just want to say the bill has been supported by over 18 community groups across the Bay Area, including Transform and San Francisco Transit Riders. Only 4 of those groups have actually submitted letters so far. So this is an important distinction that the submission of the letters through this portal, which I will share the link to, is really the important thing that we can do that will very clearly show a set of Bay Area legislators that there's broad support across the region from a number of different groups. It is supported by 6 Bay Area legislators shown here in the green area, representing districts in the green. There are a number of other, I believe 11 Bay Area legislators that are in the orange and yellow districts that have not yet taken a position on the bill. No one yet, either as an individual or an organization, has expressed opposition to the bill. So if you want to find out to see if you live in a district where your assembly member either already supports the bill or has not yet taken a position, you can click on the link where we have a map that you can dig down and see who your legislator is. So finally, the actions to support AB 2057, both now and then in the next few weeks, as well as later in April, based on our best knowledge. So that, as I mentioned, the #1 thing that you can do to support is if you have access to, if you're part of an organization, a community group, a school group, a PTA board, an agency, or a company, a small business, group letters from organizations submitted through the assembly letter portal and from all parts of the region representing different groups is going to be really important. So I will just demonstrate how you can do that. So first of all, we've provided a template letter. First of all of these links are in this blog post, seamlessbayarea.org/blog/AB2057 action. That has all of these links, and we'll send that out afterwards. But we've provided a template letter that you can customize with your letterhead and with some key points, and you can please replace the highlighted portions with your own information, and you can then submit that via the advocacy portal. So you have to if you're an organization, you need to create an account on behalf of your organization if you've never used this before, and that will enable you to log an official support position in favor of the bill. In terms of social media right now, what we've heard is the most helpful, I think, is to really just support the need for emergency funding for operations to prevent service cuts and recovery. That's what we need right now, given that the focus really, and that is the most crucial thing that we need to avert is those service cuts and ensuring that we have sufficient funding. As far as emphasizing the importance of seamless reforms, I think it's good to mention that those are important to help our service recover, but we need to be, we are not advising, you know, a very overt campaign on AB 2057 specifically over social media, just recognizing that it is not that is not the most urgent issue right now. We really need to focus on ensuring that we can move our essential workers around. The other thing that you can do immediately is sign the Seamless Transit Principles. This is a set of 7 principles that have been up on our website for a while, but we're actually planning to send those into legislators by the end of April. We already have about 1,600 individual signatures on that. So we'd like to get up over 2,000 within the next month to really show that there's broad support for these principles across the Bay Area. Later on in April and May is when we will actually be doing a push to ask you to email your legislators' offices specifically, particularly those ones who haven't yet taken a position on the bill, and to do a more targeted social media campaign for the bill specifically. But the latest information that we've heard about that is that now is not yet the time to do that, given that there's still some uncertainty as to when the legislature will be reconvening and when the committee hearings will be occurring. So with that, this final slide has, again, those links that you can copy or take a screenshot of, as well as some key contacts. Again, the #1 thing that we're looking for right now on AB 2057 is having organizations that you may be part of submit letters of support on your letterhead through this portal in the month of April. So with that, I'll stop, and I think we can move over to questions.
Thank you, Ian. So we'll switch over to the Q&A about everything we've talked about. If you have not yet asked a question and want to, please either leave a comment in the chat for the Q&A, or feel free to raise your hand button in Zoom, and then we'll call on you and you can ask your question directly. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the time we have left, which is about 10 minutes. So without further ado, I know, Adina, you picked a couple questions you wanted to answer directly. So how about we start with the first question from Helen Walsh, which is, are we including in the stats a diverse population of seniors and persons with disabilities that are both workers and use public transportation and other forms as their only means of transportation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the transit center stats that I quoted were looking in general at who out of the public transit user population are the people that are doing essential jobs, whether they are disabled or not. And of course, one of the important reasons that we want to make sure that public transportation continues to provide lifeline services during this epidemic is for people who have disabilities, people who have seniors, people who don't have any other way of getting around to essential needs. So that is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that transit continues to survive and improve beyond this crisis.
Awesome, thank you. Helen also asked, in all transportation modalities, buses, et cetera, including paratransit or others like East Bay Paratransit, are these forms included in AB 2057? Ian or Dina, do you want to handle that one?
Yes, those, the task force created by AB 2057 would be tasked with looking at all of, certainly paratransit, as well as transportation broadly, and the set of institutions involved in that to develop a set of reforms that that would be aimed at creating a seamless system across all modes, but especially on transit.
Got it. So Sue and Greg Hensley ask, why does SPUR not support this effort? Adina?
Yeah, so we have been working really closely with SPUR on policy ideas about improving the coordination of the Bay Area public transportation system, and are very closely aligned on the aspects of how to do that. And we hope that they will very shortly come on as a supporter.
Great. So then for Adina or Ian, from Ben Keller, I've heard that any state legislation not directly related to COVID, homelessness, or wildfires is very unlikely to move this year, and that legislative leadership is asking members to dramatically pare down the list of bills. Given this context, can you provide some rationale for why you think AB 2057 was likely to move forward?
Yeah, great question. So that's also what we have heard, that this is going to be a reduced, there's going to be reduced number of bills overall going through the assembly this year. And there will be a priority for those bills that are directly related to COVID-19. So we do believe that this is very important to the recovery from COVID-19, considering that COVID-19 could have an impact that will affect us for a decade or more in terms of transit ridership. So it's addressing the weaknesses within our transit system in terms of its vulnerability to these types of emergencies, and not knowing when the next emergency will strike. Initiating this process of governance reform is critical to do as soon as possible to ensure that we're ready for the next catastrophic event and that doesn't cripple our transit system the way that this has. That's the primary way that we believe that this is important. In the event of a next emergency, we think that literally the level of coordination of the transit system could, if it's a different type of emergency, it could literally save lives. So we need to use this as a wake-up call and ensure that we address these core issues. Another just point to be clear about is that this task force will not prevent our transit operators from addressing the very near-term needs that they need to address in terms of responding over the next several months or 12 months, however long we're in a different state of affairs. The task force's activities would really start only in 2021, but it's very important that we get this process started now because governance reform does, it will take time. It will take, 2 years may seem like a long time, but that's still a very short time frame for undertaking the scale of the institutional reforms that we're looking to do.
So we've got one question that's answered in the chat that I think we should bring up. Is Claire was asking, why is the MTC not a network manager?
Ooh, okay, I'll try to briefly, so there are some laws that actually have attempted to there are some things in MTC's mandate that suggest that it should be doing certain things, and it does have the authority to do things like coordinate fares and schedules. There have been legislative attempts to require it to do that in the past. Yet despite those laws, MTC has not effectively been able to accomplish that. And we still have 27 different fare structures, and obviously if anyone's used transit, that that's not really what is happening despite these laws many times existing for 20 or 30 years. What we've determined through interviews and our research is that there are other factors that prevent MTC from doing this. One is the conflicting board structures that we have of so many different agencies that, despite MTC having those mandates, there's no direct accountability between local transit agency boards and MTC, and each transit agency continues to have fiduciary responsibility over their own budget. And the other factor that we have heard many times is that MTC is not the way its governance structure works, consisting solely of locally elected representatives. It's that structure where there's no transit, it's not conducive to MTC putting conditions on local authorities, because local agency officials are always unlikely to withhold money from their own local jurisdictions to meet certain regional goals. When we look at effective network managers from other parts of the world, they have very different board structures that include transit agency expertise, more representatives that represent the region as a whole instead of just parts of the region. So we believe that there needs to be changes to whoever the network manager would be. It has to be a governing and board structure that isn't solely comprised of locally elected representatives. you were muted. If Armand, I don't know if you're speaking right.
Sorry. One more. Let's get one more question in before we head out to 12:45. Susan Harris asked, and an anonymous attendee asked, amongst other groups like the Sierra Club of SF Bay Area and SPUR, what are other influential groups that have yet to express support for AB 2057 that we're hoping to get their support?
That's a great question. Yeah, go ahead, Adina.
Oh, okay, sure. We have been talking pretty extensively to labor groups, and we have some labor affiliated groups that have signed the seamless transit principles and have gotten a favorable input and feedback at our meetings, and hope to have more of them officially sign on in support. Ian, do you have any additional comments?
No, I think environmental groups like the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, you know, these groups all, we believe, are predisposed to support, but we need help to reach these groups. We need people who work within these groups or who volunteers within these groups. So if you see a missing organization from that list, in many cases, it isn't because they've opposed the bill. It is just that we are, you know, we've only been able to get to a certain number. So this is where, again, your connections are really critical. But yeah, the big groups that we know are important in Sacramento and influential with legislators. The environmental groups are the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, and the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. Labor groups that are important are the Amalgamated Transit Union, Ask Me. So if you're members of those unions, you can encourage your leadership to support this legislation and building trades. And then SPUR, of course, SPUR, many of you may be members of SPUR. I think we're feeling good about their likelihood to support this, but you feel free to let them know that you would like them to endorse AB 2057 as well.
Great. So we are at 12:46, so I'm respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. We want to thank, special thanks to our friends at San Francisco Transit Writers and Transform for co-presenting. As we mentioned, we'll be sending an email to everyone who attended today's webinar for information, resources, and links to everything we talked about today. Please do not hesitate. I saw some questions that dropped in at the very last minute. We'll try to answer those questions with you directly, but feel free to email us or reach out and get involved. We could not be more grateful for your advocacy during such a turbulent time. And I would personally express my gratitude as well to Adina and Ian, our staff, who are doing an amazing job. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Wash your hands, stay safe, and let's get this done. Thank you very much.